Good evening. I'm Won Chen, a student at the University of Washington Engage program, here to welcome you to our event tonight. I study the threats of dams on freshwater fish, and I use mathematics and statistics to learn how we can mitigate these threats without sacrificing dams' roles for society. As a graduate student, I get really specialized training in how to do a very specific type of research. The Engage program gave me another type of training that graduate students rarely get. I learned how to talk about my science in a way that is engaging, informative, and enlightening. You can learn more about our innovative program at engage-science.com. And I get to have this opportunity because of the special collaboration between Town Hall and UW's Engage program. Together, they host a series called UW's Science Now as part of the Seattle Science Lectures. Sponsors include Microsoft and KPLU. I would also like to mention that the best way to keep up with Town Hall's program is to become a member. Membership offers downfront seating, discounts on book and ticket purchases, and a mailed copy of Town Hall's monthly calendar, and provides the support essential to bringing you more than 400 events annually at affordable ticket prices. Tonight's speaker program will run about 25 minutes, including 5 minutes for your questions. We ask that you come to the mics at the end of the stage so we can pick you up for the recording that we're making. Before I introduce our guests, though, I'd like to mention some other events from our science series. First of all, please join us tonight for Peter Wilcox, who will discuss his book, Greenpeace Captain, My Adventures in Protecting the Future of Our Planet, tonight at 7:30, following this Engage talk. Also, the next 2 talks in the UW Science Now speaker series will be right here, Thursday, May 12th, starting at 6 p.m. I will talk about preserving freshwater fish, rivers, and dams, and Roxanne Carini will discuss breaking waves, the coastal environment. And now to our main speaker. The ocean, with its ever-changing depths, tides, and shifts, remains one of the planet's greatest mysteries. Because of this, students like Leah Johnson of the School of Oceanography and the Applied Physics Lab devote time to studying it at length. Johnson will share her research on ocean fronts in upper ocean zones, which have a variety of surprising effects. Please give a warm welcome to Leah Johnson.
Thanks for that introduction, Will. And I'd like to take a moment to say how much I've really enjoyed this Engage program. And I think it's really a fantastic collaboration that they have with Town Hall, and that I get to speak here tonight. So I just want to extend a thanks to both of those. And the title of my talk is At the Ocean Front, Dynamics That Stoke Ocean Ecosystems. And I'm going to start with this picture right here. This was taken just a little over a month ago, and this is the Pacific Northwest coast. So just to orient ourselves here, we can see Vancouver Island and Puget Sound, and then that's where we are, right at Town Hall. But what I really want to bring your attention to are these beautiful teal structures that twist and swirl off the coast in the ocean. This is a signature of massive amounts of microscopic marine organisms called phytoplankton. And for the most part, these phytoplankton don't swim, and they're moved by the currents. And so this is direct sign of the ocean's flow. Now, there's a couple of scales here. One thing that you'll notice is that there's more phytoplankton closer to the coast than there is offshore. But then if we look, we see these smaller scales, and these are the scales that are swirling and twisting, and what really, I think, makes this image so beautiful. And a lot of these features are associated with a physical dynamic called an ocean density front. And this is where less dense water and more dense water sit side by side. This interaction between ocean fronts and biology is the subject of my talk today. And I'll talk about fronts later, but I'm going to start with biology. And so we're going to start with where life begins in the ocean, which is with these microscopic marine organisms called phytoplankton. And just one drop of water contains thousands of these little guys. And their name says a lot about them. Plankton, which means that they're floaters, and they kind of go with the flow. So they're moved around by the ocean, which is a little bit of a hint to the importance of physics here. And phyto, because they use light to grow. And that means that they photosynthesize, which makes them very analogous to the plants here on land. So when they photosynthesize, they take in light, carbon dioxide, and food, and they use that in order to grow and to multiply and to produce oxygen. And in fact, half of the oxygen that we are breathing right now was made by phytoplankton in the ocean. Now, there's many different types of phytoplankton, and I think I'll just go over a couple of them here, or a few of them here. So the ones that we were looking at, these are diatoms. They're the most abundant phytoplankton in the ocean. And they have a silica casing, which is the compound that makes glass. So sometimes people refer to these as little organisms in glass houses. And then this is actually just one phytoplankton. It's called a coccolithophore, and it's covered in many different plates that are made out of calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate is the compound that makes chalk and limestone. And these are thought to be so abundant that on geologic time scales, they're thought to have created the White Cliffs of Dover, which is pretty cool. And then these little unassuming guys, they're actually a type of diatom, but I wanted to talk specifically about these because under harmful conditions, they can produce domoic acid, which is a toxin, and when that goes into the oceans, it causes paralytic shellfish poisoning, which makes it that we can't go clamming, we can't eat our oysters, and is responsible for huge fish die-offs on the coast. So already we're getting a sense that these microscopic organisms have a huge impact. And they do have a huge impact. The fact that they're primary producers means that they're the base of the ocean food chain. And by the way, I'm going to use this word primary production a lot, and that just means lots of phytoplankton growth. So as these phytoplankton grow, they are the base of the food chain and provide sustenance for these larger organisms. And this is very good. This means that they fuel ecosystems, and they're really essential for the health of our fisheries. But like I alluded to before, sometimes in the wrong environmental conditions, they can create toxins, which can result in huge die-offs. And you may have heard about this. They're referred to as harmful algal blooms. But in addition to being important for marine life, they're also a really essential piece of the global carbon cycle. And that's because as they photosynthesize, they take carbon dioxide out of the water. And this allows the ocean to absorb more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, if these phytoplankton get munched on near the surface, then they're just going to be respired back into CO2. But a few of them, they die and they sink away from the surface ocean. And these are the ones that are important for the carbon cycle. So the more phytoplankton that sink away from the surface, the more that the ocean can absorb atmospheric CO2. And this is referred to as the biological pump. And that's because biology here is acting as a pathway to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So phytoplankton are pretty abundant, but where can we find these guys? Where do we expect to find them in the ocean? And the answer is really everywhere, but we can expect to find them more in certain places than others. And the reason why we know this is because we can detect them from space. Well, actually what we detect from space is chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is a byproduct of photosynthesis, and it's actually what makes plants green. So we can use satellites in order to detect chlorophyll in our oceans, and that can tell us how much phytoplankton there are. And this is an image of a year-long average of chlorophyll in the oceans, and we see that there's a geographic distribution. But what if we want to know about how phytoplankton are going to grow in the future, maybe for next year, for our fisheries, for the fisheries, or what the carbon cycle is going to look like in 100 years from now? In order to do this, we don't have data for the future. So in order to do this, scientists use computer simulations, or what we like to call models. And we use this in order to predict what this is going to look like in the future. For example, this one, which is the Parallel Ocean Program made by the Los Alamos National Lab. And right here, we're seeing daily values of chlorophyll produced by this model. And I just want to point out that there's a lot of structure in this image, and that's because a lot of these features are evolving on faster timescales, and they really get smeared out in that year-long average. So I'm going to argue that in order to be able to model phytoplankton accurately, we're going to need to know two things. One, we're going to need to know their behavior, and two, we're going to need to be able to know their environment. Now, there's a lot of nuances to understanding their behavior, and there's a lot of really brilliant scientists out there who are working towards understanding this. But since I'm a physicist, today I'm going to be talking about the environment. So, what environment do phytoplankton live in? And to talk about this, it's helpful to remind ourselves that phytoplankton are floaters, so they go with the ocean flow. And again, they photosynthesize, which means that they need light, carbon dioxide, and food in order to reproduce. But really, the ocean has plenty of carbon dioxide, so what's going to limit this is food and light. Now let's consider during summertime when the sun is warming the upper ocean and the winds are relatively light. That means as the winds blow along the surface ocean, they're going to churn up just a very shallow layer of the ocean surface. And this is referred to as the mixed layer. Phytoplankton in this layer are going to be near the sunlit part of the ocean. But the fact that they're in this shallow layer means that they use up their food supply very quickly. And so in summertime, phytoplankton have a lot of sunlight, but not that much food. So in wintertime, the surface ocean cools and the winds really pick up, and this causes a lot of churning and really deepens this mixed layer, which entrains a lot of that food up from below, which is great. Now the phytoplankton have food, but now they're getting mixed down below the surface ocean, so they don't have a lot of sunlight. So in winter, phytoplankton have a lot of food, but not that much sun. Now there's a sweet spot that happens in between these two seasons. In spring, when the mixed layer gets shallow again, but now it has a lot of food from that wintertime mixing. And this results in huge phytoplankton production called phytoplankton blooms, which we can see from space, which is pretty cool. And this is an example of a spring phytoplankton bloom off the coast of Iceland. And we see that it spans several hundred square miles, which is pretty remarkable. So here's a cloud, but the phytoplankton signature is underneath. And even this but we can see that this phytoplankton signature is patchy and has this kind of structure to it, which gives a hint that maybe this seasonal cycle isn't the whole story here. And this is where fronts come in. So before I talk about fronts, I'm going to talk about ocean physics, and then we're going to start talking about ocean physics. And really, much of the ocean physics is dictated by its density. And there are two things that determine the ocean's density: temperature and salinity. But for this talk, we're going to just assume that temperature controls density, which is a pretty good assumption for most parts of the ocean. I'm going to be showing a lot of images like this. This is sea surface temperature. And for all these images, warm water is going to be red, and blue water is going to be cold. And what we see here is that the ocean has a climate, with warmer waters near the equator and colder waters near the poles, kind of like they have on land, like we have on land. But actually, if we zoom in, what we see is that these changes in temperature aren't smooth and continuous, but can actually occur very quickly over a small region, like this one right here. And these are called fronts. And so this long front that we're looking at is the Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic. And it's long and elongated, but sometimes these long fronts can start to wiggle and meander, and some of these meanders get so big that they fold in on themselves, pinch off, and form these little coherent rings called eddies, which really take on a life of their own. And just to give you some scale here, these eddies are about 70 miles wide in diameter, and That's about the size of the Olympic National Park. So here we have this one large front, but also we notice that embedded in this picture are a lot of smaller structures, and these are smaller fronts and eddies. And even though they're smaller, you can see that they're everywhere, and they can actually play a pretty important role in the oceans. So we've seen what these fronts look like from a top view, but they actually have a vertical structure. So if we kind of slice through this front, we can look at what it might look like in depth. So here we have this light, warmer water sitting next to this heavy cold water. But wait a second, if we had a glass of water here, then that warm water would sit on top of that cold, dense water, very much how oil sits on top of heavier vinegar. So why can we have these two sitting side by side in the ocean? And it has to do a lot with length scales. So this front spans several miles, where our glass of water is just a couple of inches at most. And so that means that this front is feeling the Earth's rotation. So what do I mean by that? And to explain this, first let's consider motions within this room. So if I were to throw a ball across the room to a buddy, and my aim was good, then the ball would travel in a straight line to its intended recipient. Now let's say my buddy was in Baja, for example, and I wanted to throw my ball to him. Well, I gain my arm strength, throw, and while the ball is in the air, Baja is actually rotating away from my ball, and my ball ends up landing somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. So even though the ball traveled in a straight line, to my buddy and to me, it looks as though the ball was deflected to the right by something that we call the Coriolis force. And this Coriolis force is responsible for all the swirly motions that we see in the atmosphere and in the ocean. So what does that mean for our front? Well, we have our front, and what happens is that the warm water, the less dense water, wants to slide on top of the cold, more dense water. But it feels the Earth's rotation and is deflected to the right by the Coriolis force, causing a long front current in the that's perpendicular to our front. And this puts our front in something that we call geostrophic balance, and allows these fronts to be maintained over time. Similarly, this geostrophic balance happens in our circular eddies, but now the flow is going round and round in a circle and allows these eddies to be maintained through time, which is pretty cool. And we can see evidence for this in our oceans. So right here, we're looking at an image of the global ocean's currents. And the length of the lines correspond to how fast the currents are moving, and the color is sea surface temperature. And so we can see that some of the ocean's most energetic currents are also in regions where there's the sharpest changes in density. And these are associated with fronts, some of the major fronts, and I've labeled them here. And just to let you know, maybe you've heard of these, we have the Kuroshio that exists in the North Pacific, and I've already showed you the Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic. And in the Southern Ocean, we have the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, and this is the only current that wraps around the entire globe, which I think is pretty cool. So these are the ocean's largest fronts. But I want to just remind you that if we keep on zooming into this, we see an explosion of structure and embedded into this large temperature field. And so even though we have these large fronts and these large eddies that exist, if we look closely enough, we see that there's a lot more smaller fronts and smaller eddies in this field. And just to give you guys some reference, these are the fronts that I study at the university. And we've really only known about them for the past decade or so. And we can attribute that to advances in technology that has allowed our model resolution to increase and our observations to get finer. So even though these small features are about 1/10 the size of the larger ones, we can see that they're very prevalent in the oceans, which hints to their importance. But we've actually known about these kind of larger fronts for quite some time, and that's evident in this map of the Gulf Stream made by Benjamin Franklin in the 1700s. But it was really the fishermen who knew about fronts, as they recognized that regions of sharp density, sharp temperature changes were also regions where they would get the most catch. And a fisherman by the name of Tom Folger was actually the one who helped Benjamin Franklin map the Gulf Stream in the 1700s because he recognized it as a place to that attracted sperm whales. And this was really felt globally. People around the world understood that frontal regions were regions of high productivity, so much so that a Japanese oceanographer wrote a haiku about it, and I'm going to read it to you here. It can be translated as, "Off the Isle Kazan in twilight, along a rippling streak extending far off the Kuroshio front, a dolphin shoal runs, skipping, over a sunset glowing sea." So why? What is it about these fronts that really make them hot spots for these animals? And it goes back to phytoplankton. And that's because these fronts have a circulation associated with them that draw up water from depths. And they really draw up water on the cold side of the front, and with it they bring this nutrient-rich fluid from the depth up into the surface sunlit ocean, which allows them to be consumed by phytoplankton. And this relationship between fronts and phytoplankton is strikingly apparent when we juxtapose sea surface temperature with surface chlorophyll, like these images here off the Gulf Stream. And one thing that we notice is that there's more chlorophyll on the cold side of the front than on the warm side of the front. And that it's quite amazing that the interface between these two practically mirror each other. And I also want to point out these smaller scale features, these smaller scale fronts that we can see here. And some of these are associated with even higher amounts of chlorophyll, suggesting that these smaller fronts are enhancing primary productivity on top of this larger field. And this image is really cool because it also has an ocean eddy in it, which is right here. And we can see that even this eddy is contributing to the chlorophyll, which is quite amazing. So there's examples of these everywhere in the oceans. And I just wanted to show one more example. This is off Point Conception in California. And what I like about this image is now they have vertical, they have actual in situ ocean data, which we can see here. And so we see this red temperature that turns to yellow, and that's our front. And we see this heightened amount of chlorophyll that's on the dense side of the front. And again, we can see that these structures and the temperature and chlorophyll fields practically mirror each other. So is there evidence that this phytoplankton growth that happens at fronts really affects these higher predators and these other organisms? And the answer is yes. There's a lot of studies that have shown that frontal regions are important places for the feeding habits of sharks and turtles. And I'm just going to show you one of these examples here. This was generously loaned to me by a researcher at the Applied Physics Lab. And what we're looking at here are these black contours we can think of as being eddies. And the color is ocean chlorophyll, and the black dots are little turtles that have been tagged. And this is off of the Argentina coast in the Southern Ocean. And so what we see here is that these tagged turtles are able to find these little eddies. And when they do little loops around these eddies, which is evidence that they're foraging in these features. And I think this is just a really beautiful example of how these eddies are little floating ecosystems that can be detected and found by other organisms. So, I was really searching for some evidence that I might be able to answer the question, what's the global impact of these fronts? And the answer is we don't really know yet. We know that it's big. The case studies have shown us that these are very important, but we haven't converged yet on a number that tells us how important these are. And I think that really shows the state of this, that it's a work in progress. And it's such a really interesting research question, and it brings together scientists from all different disciplines, from biologists and chemists and physicists and computer scientists. And together we're working towards how to incorporate these fronts into our forecasts so that we might know how fisheries are going to respond in the next coming years, or what the global carbon cycle is going to look like in 100 years from now. So stay tuned. And with that, I'm going to just close with this image. And this is an image of chlorophyll in the Southern Ocean, taken from the Drake Passage. And it's just a beautiful reminder of this intricate interplay between the physics and the biology. And nicely outlines this theme that I was talking about how there's a large range of scales that are all working together to make this complex flow field. And with that, I'll take questions. Greg.
How are you going about trying to come up with the number for kind of how important it is?
There's two ways that we can do this. One way is to just figure out a way to implement them into the models, and then run the models with the front's impact and run it without, and figure out that difference in order to come up with the global estimate. Another way that we can do that is by using these case studies and extrapolating from them. So for example, there was one case study that showed that fronts not only bring up fluid from the surface and enhance phytoplankton growth, but they also, when that circulation goes down, they're bringing phytoplankton down away from that surface layer and enhancing what we call subduction, and taking that phytoplankton away. And if you have an idea of how that might work in that one region, you might be able to extrapolate to other places. But we're not quite there yet. Well, thank you. Thank you so much.